I'm glad you're here. I'm glad you're available and ready. Uh-oh, can't hear me? Uh-oh. Now that's going to be a problem because I talk really, really low. Glad you can make it out. This is going to be a conversation around understanding, cloud reference models. I'm pretty sure today you guys have heard all kinds of different conversations around cloud and some of the technologies and movements. Today it's going to be more really understanding the models and understanding the business transformation that's actually happening and how you can actually look at the transformation of the cloud and how it and its impacts respond to you guys and your organizations very specifically. All right, so a couple of things, right? What is cloud computing? Everybody has different notions. I don't know if you guys saw that Microsoft ad that used to come out, man. It was amazing because, the person would, oh my God, they take a picture and she'd be like, off to the cloud. And unfortunately, that gave the wrong premise of what the cloud is. No one really quite got that whole message. They thought it was a video editing thing, and, it was like, no, really, it's not. But, I've actually laid out really 3 easy definitions really at the top for this piece of the conversation. It is really the reducing the intermediaries between the user and the resource, right? It's very simplistic, right? It's understanding that, if I can go to my refrigerator and pull out a meal and cook that meal, that's better than going to fast food. Right? It's that self-service conversation that's happening that's, getting out everywhere. Right? Other areas is to understand that they're pooled resources. Okay? Pooled resources is an extremely interesting conversation when you start getting into IT because you start talking about ownership to a certain degree. And if I would, I'm going to tell you pooled resources to me, when you look at it from this cloud perspective, is more like what I call the printer theory. Right? And people look at me and go, well, what is that? What is that? Right? So the printer theory is pretty easy. Everybody uses it to print. Right? You guys got a printer and somewhere in your block that prints out, but no one really knows who buys the paper, right? Because why do I care? I don't, it's got paper, it's got print, I need to go print, let's print. That's a shared resource, and that's the way IT is supposed to move, both in the economic sense, right, fiscally, and then both in the resource sense, is to understand that it's a tool to be used to gain to that next level, right? Because we're the knowledge workers in this conversation. Right? And then understanding that resource aggregation, right, to the ability to scale to that particular opportunity that you're looking for. That's also key when you start looking at cloud computing, right? But, otherwise you can look at it from all the different architecture and so forth. You just kind of lump everything into what the cloud is in general. But it's some very discrete conversations around the way the technology has changed. Right, and to be even more clearer about this concept of change, I don't know if anybody looks at IDC. Their IDC looks at it from what's called the third platform. And I think visualizing it this way is a lot easier when you start talking about how to manifest what the cloud itself is. And when you start thinking about it from the first platform, that was back in the old mainframe days, right? It was centralized, it had the right controls, it had all the things that was able to give the resources, time sharing capabilities as a good example, moving forward in aggregating those resources against thousands of users, right? It was, but it was hundreds of applications to thousands of users. Right? And as we move to that next platform, that's when we start getting that distributed computing and that conversation. And that whole scenario allowed us to start getting computers at home, kids with iTabs and tablets are starting to pop up everywhere now. And that is a different platform because that platform allowed us to understand the difference when we started looking at hundreds and hundreds of applications and thousands of users. Right? So it was a change in the dynamic. How do I get that application out to you? Right? Back in the day, I remember getting an application out, somebody involved taking a CD out to their desk and installing it from there. Right? That was application distribution. Right? But that doesn't scale. There's no way for that to scale. And so now we've gotten to that third platform. And that third platform is billions of users and millions of applications. Right? It's that whole paradigm shift, that process and that provisioning shift that's happened again at the third platform. right? And that's where we're at now, where we're looking at the explosion of mobile devices and tablets and so forth. A great example of this conversation is that when I went to work, to start off with, we went for a laptop. When I got there, it was like, all right, you guys better have a laptop, cell phone, all the key things. Nowadays, when kids go into schools, into workforce today, they're going, I need my laptop, or no, I need my tablet. Right? That's what I need. I need to be able to get access everywhere instantly and for everything, right? So it's changed the process greatly, right? So I work with different customers. Facebook is actually one of our customers. Amazon, you kind of go down the list, and they've brought some really interesting perspectives to the way IT is supposed to be run today. Right? Because the consumers have changed the perspective on the way that they view IT. A good example of this is my wife, right? My wife currently uses 7 different clouds, right? As a consumer, 7 different clouds. As a person in IT, we don't use that many clouds, but as a consumer, she expects Facebook to be up, available from her phone, from her laptop, from everywhere, right? And we all in this room know that's almost impossible to do. But from a general sense, when it's down, she's upset, and there's real upsetness, and it's like, dude, I don't know what you guys are talking about. But it's that level of service that she's expecting that is now transformed into what IT is expecting from us. Right? My son the other day, he actually bought his first actual game from an actual GameStop where it was a computer-based game. And he had to take it home and he had to install the application. And of course, it was 3 gigs and it downloaded and it took 2.5 hours. I mean, every minute he was down there like, my God, how long is this going to be? And I'm like, son, that's just the way it works, man. That's just the way it was. He's like, because he's used to the iPad. You push the button, you get the app comes down, start playing. Right? That change, that culture change is what's really happening, and it's needing for us to change the way that we deliver services to our end users, right? Right? And those services really start talking towards that third platform or that user-centric conversation, right? Because my user is the most important resource now. That's why when you start looking at how do I enable cloud services into my IT organization, I have to really look at the end user requirement. Right, versus just looking at the server-based requirement, and that changes, greatly. A great example of that is virtual desktops. Often I got pulled into conversations around virtual desktops, and they would look at it in the same way that they would look at server consolidation. Whereas server consolidation is entirely different, because as an administrator, I can wait a minute for a mouse to move one direction and go on to something else. But as an end user, if their VM is slow, everything's wrong. Right? There's no way to look at it from one way versus the other, because it's about a perception that's necessary to take into play. And that's that end user focus that when you start building out your cloud-based environments, you want to start looking towards. Right? Because normally, right, when you start looking at it from the user-centric scenario, this is what our users are doing. Right? They're used to working at home. They were, that Skype, man, that thing's going to come in crazy for us, right? But this is the way the world is transforming. We do everything from that compute-centric scenario, right? And to really talk towards this, the gentleman that was up here before was talking about a transformation in IT, and I completely agree with this. And this particular slide is one thing that I want to stress on. And a lot of times when people talk cloud, it's usually trying to be technology-driven. Okay, and doing technology-driven scenarios actually create what's called technical debt, right? Because you're taking a bit of technology and you're saying, hey, I'm going to put another 10% around operations. I brought this virtualization in play, but operations, I don't know if you guys know how all this works, but this is what we're going to do now. Right? And, actually when it gets all the way back up to the top, the vision itself may have been, only about 5% of the conversation. Right? A great example of this is the CEO of eBay. He came out and said, I want a one-click buy option. And this is great, because that was the vision. That was the vision. He said, I want a one-click buy option. And of course, 3.5 months later, the team comes together. They come up in front of him. They're like, all right, here we go. CEO, he pushes the button, and it says, are you sure? He's like, dude, I said one click. This was the key. This was the vision I gave you, was one click. Now, we've got 2 clicks. How are we really going to work this out? What's the operations and so forth around it? It's understanding that you want to change that process, because clearly it's entirely different when you start thinking about it from the cloud. You want to take it from a large level of vision. You want to take as much as the understanding that you can take into what do I want to get from the cloud, because there are so many different options, right? It's actually, you know, when you talk about the reference models around cloud, it's looking at the atmospheric scenario in which there are cumulus clouds, there are, you know, halo clouds, all kinds of different ones, and you should be taking advantage of all the different virtualization capabilities. As a great example, you know, I may want to use server consolidation with VMware inside, but I may want to use desktop virtualization on Hyper-V because it's cheaper, costs less, and has all the right functionality, but I still want to provide a level of development inside, and I may want to use a Zen server hypervisor. Now, there's nothing wrong with using all those different technologies, but you had to understand the value before, instead of going it from a technology first approach, going, okay, well, I have this one piece of technology and it does virtualization, I should apply it from here to there to there to there, without really taking that premise and understanding what's actually happening. Because if you go from the value in the business outcome, right, then you can start looking at it from the operational perspective differently on understanding those requirements, as well as when you finally get down to the technology, you have a clear sense of what you're wanting, very clearly what type of technology, right? I don't know how many of you guys buy cars, but now that the internet's so cool and key with cars, man, I go through a million different things before I actually step onto a lot, right? There's different, you know, avenues. I want to buy this, I want to get that, I want to make sure that this works, you know, miles per gallon needs to be so, how many different locations. That's kind of where we're talking about. It's drilled down that key conversation. Right? It's because as you start looking at it, there's a lot that's necessary, and that's from what we call that spectrum of success, right? So an example of that is self-service, right? In a large state agency here locally, as an example, I built a cloud reference model that a lot of people are using today for bringing in applications and so forth into some of these tier 1 and tier 3 data center scenarios. And when, you know, I built out this cloud, I put everything in it, man. I gave them IaaS capabilities. They were able to drop things in and everything of that nature, and they go, you know, that's cool, but we don't know how to really use this. Right? I love the idea that you gave us self-service, but our users, they can't understand self-service right now. And so that was my 5, right? My 5 was, okay, every user has to be able to do it from their smartphone, right? But, you know, the actual, you know, engineer and architect I was working with, his 5 for his company was just so that IT could provision self-service, right? So understanding that difference and understanding that spectrum is really important when you start looking at what you want to get from the cloud. Right? What can the people obtain? What can they actually do from that perspective? And understanding the people is key, because I'll give you another great example. Once again, in the state scenario, right? There was a blade chassis environment, okay? And in the blade chassis environment, we had one business unit that was wanting to put out 200 plus servers and in an area, and they knew that they could do it on virtualization in this blade chassis. Well, the other part of the blade chassis, we were building for virtualization and cloud-based conversation. And I expressed that, you know, the hardware team's going, okay, well, we can come in and we can separate this and we'll put up these particular storage and everything of that nature. And I'm like, no, hold on. We don't need to separate the blade chassis, because we have a virtualization layer here that we can use to give them what they want and them what they want. It's an entire change of a mindset instead of the traditional silos that we're all currently accustomed to in our movements, right? Because there's a lot about change, right? Our major focus is the application. Right? People, you know, go to work because of Exchange and email. They don't necessarily go to work because of the server that Exchange is running on. Right? It's about the application and the understanding. And then everything else today is choice. Right? You want it on-premise or off-premise? Great choice. You want it heterogeneous or homogeneous? Right? You want it to be a CapEx conversation, or do you want it to be operational? Right? You can make huge differences today with what you're actually trying to obtain, right? Going out to the public cloud as a great scenario is not necessarily conducive for everyone, because even at the rates that you see that they're running at 0.2 cents per CPU time, running a full run rate server out there is still more expensive than running and buying your own server internally. right? So you have to take that in consideration. But if I was a financial company and I wanted to run a large-scale financial model, okay, and the only place I knew where I could do it at would be Amazon, and they're going to charge me $135,000, but I'm going to make $4 billion off of it. I can make the justification, right, very easily. And that's key, because each different cloud is a different type. It's all about the different choices you have, as long as you're still clear on your fundamental. Your fundamental is the application that I need to provide to the end user, right? Everything else below it is all choice, and you decide that choice, right? So, as I've gone around to multiple different places, we found that there are some very key initiatives that really spark cloud conversations, right? You can accelerate delivery of internal services, right? Often we have people who ask that question, right? I have virtualization in play. Why is it that I don't have a cloud? Okay, well, the reason you don't have that is because you have a level of technical debt that is exhibited when you want to move to the actual cloud, because the cloud involves the ability to scale. Okay, that technical debt, very simply put, is easy, right? Do you have a provisional process for a user to ask for a new VM? And if the answer is no, that's a level of technical debt. If you have a place in which you're set that a person who puts a VM on a tier 1 hard drive or space inside of my virtualization environment, and I don't have a release policy that says when that VM is out of there, right, I can end up with hundreds of VMs sitting on tier 1 storage, consuming a large number of dollars for no reason. Right? Understanding that there are those feature sets inside of virtualization that you're trying to extend, you have to be able to extend it to that degree without incurring additional technical debt. Simplistically put, it's a Band-Aid that you decided to put in place of the actual work that you should have did. Right? Inside of the other piece is embracing multi-source or transformation of an application portfolio, as well as a lot of them very clearly are generating new service revenue. Right? A lot of cloud environments are about generating new service revenue. An example of one that we're working with inside of a state agency as an example, there is an agency that has a large number of information that they cannot provide to every other person because of a security scenario, that we're finding a workaround to use the cloud to allow a larger force of police force to utilize this application, but still adhering to the security that's necessary for that internal and external conversation, right? But there was no way they could do it internally because they can't scale it internally, right? Because they don't know if 500 people are going to use it today or if 2,000 people are going to use it tomorrow. Right, and that's really when you start looking at the technology that's involved, that's some of the major differences, is that the technology is based on some scale conversations that you're not necessarily used to unless you're actually looking at that third platform, billions of users and thousands and hundreds of thousands of applications. Right? So we'll talk a little bit about those real quickly, right? Some of those external models that exist, right? Just to be clear, IaaS is the infrastructure as a service scenario. We have what's called a platform as a service scenario, and we have software as a service. Okay? These are all the ways that we're currently exhibiting or shaping the type of cloud there is. Right? And then to really kind of gather it all together, you guys are supposed to be IT as a service, right? Because as you're building that service portfolio, that's really what you're trying to accomplish and maintain. Now, to be clear, I think it's easier when you reference it in the idea of the sphere of control and your sphere of influence. Okay? A sphere of control as an existence, in traditional IT, you manage everything. Everything's yours. Everybody manages it. Often, you have business units who buy inside of your location and put things in your data center, right? They own it. That's theirs. You can't really do anything. It's like, when you start moving to virtualization, like, hey, I want to add 4 more servers, and you're a business unit, it's like, cool, I can add 4 more virtual servers to the environment. Where's the ownership demarcation at? Right? That's a conversation that you want to make sure you have.
I just want to ask you a quick question.
Go for it.
Are you going to make your handouts available on a website that we can go
Absolutely. They're actually recording this, and then they had me copy it over so you guys can actually get a copy of the presentation. Don't worry. So the traditional IT, you manage it very specifically. When you start moving to infrastructure as a service, that's actually the first evolutionary step for most of your environments today. You want to provide a layer of hardware and compute and storage and networking to the individual environments. You can do it in multiple different allocation scenarios, but to be clear, you control or is managed usually by a vendor for IaaS. So I could call Rackspace and go, hey, I want an IaaS implementation, and they will provide you a layer of virtualization where you can manage it from the VM up. So you can put the app in, you can put anything you want in. Now, often that's called an entitlement cloud because you're entitled to X amount of space and X amount of conversation. How many VMs you put in that space is all up to you, right? Because if I give you 10 terabytes of disk space and 10 gigahertz of compute capacity, you could put hundreds of machines in there if they only did, 512K worth of this or that. So that's your entitlement type scenario in the IaaS. Often, that's what we start seeing as you start moving outward. You start moving next to what's called your platform as a service, okay? And most of you guys, if you look at traditional IT is a platform as a service scenario because the IT will manage the data center and the infrastructure. There'll be somebody who's managing storage and compute, and then usually there's some other special materials expert that's managing the application layer, right? Who's managing Exchange, who's managing SAP, who's managing, Link or any of those type of technologies. That's that application layer that the platform as a service scenario is at. Okay, you want to be able to deliver an application that will talk to another database, that will talk to this other back-end piece, but I don't care what virtualization platform it's on, and I definitely don't care where it's actually generally located. I just care that the application is doing what I want it to do. Right? And so that's your platform as a service scenario. Where would you find those out there? That's the Ruby on Rails. Those are a lot of the different Terramont, grid power, joinnet type scenarios that are platforms as a service. They'll provide you the entire development environment that you can develop within, right? You can make your app do what you want it to do, and you don't have to worry about anything below it. Okay? And then you have the far out right, which, as you start looking at, as cloud started maturing, SaaS was one of the first entry points into this conversation because it was, Salesforce is the largest SaaS provider there is, as a great example. They're providing the application to the endpoint, right? If you look at Facebook would be a SaaS type application because it's actually providing apps to the end user from that particular perspective. Whether you're managing your trips or whether you're managing your friends, however it's actually working, that's really key to that piece of the conversation. Okay? So as you can see, those also look at your sphere of influence and your sphere of control. Right? So now, as I say, the moniker on this particular session was Cloud Reference Models and Understanding Cloud Reference Models. Okay, so I'm going through those, but I wanted to point out something very specific about this one. This is the NIST Cloud Framework, right? So if you ever did anything, you can say, hey, I looked at the official cloud reference architecture. Right, this is the official one. This is the one everybody's supposed to be building towards. Okay, this is the one that has a conglomeration of different people who are putting down the different characteristics. And the key is that they can only really give you characteristics of a cloud. Right, that's what the control is about. How do I decide, if a cloud is actually on a USB key or a cloud is an extended infrastructure that extends everywhere, right? This is the NIST-based cloud framework. It helps you understand how hybrid clouds are supposed to respond, how private clouds are supposed to respond, and community clouds are supposed to respond. Most of the cloud providers, and when you start seeing things like Cloud Stack or OpenStack, any of those type of automation or management scenarios that come into play, they're building around this definition so that they will have the interaction with other cloud-based infrastructures and so forth. So this is the one that marries the glue together. Okay? But I'm going to break it down even further for you because this is where you have a great understanding of the technology, but I'm not going to go very technical with it. Okay, we'll keep it very high level. The simplest cloud reference model starts out with a host. The host is a virtualization node, right? Regardless of what hypervisor it's using, because there are multiples that are out there, it is represented by the host that's going to run multiple VMs. Okay? To have a cluster, okay, you can have multiple hosts inside that cluster. Okay? If you're familiar with VMware as an example, VMware follows this particular model very specifically. Right? If you're familiar with Citrix or Microsoft, they have the same model as far as a cluster and a host. If you follow the Amazon type locations that are out there, they follow this extensively from a host cluster model scenario. Okay? And you have normally within your cluster is your primary storage for those hosts. The reason that is so important is because that cluster is where all the VMs will have their high availability, their multi-tenancy, their ability to move around with each other. So the primary storage has to be within the actual cluster itself. Okay? Now, of course, you can have n number of clusters inside of a zone, or what's called a pod in this situation. Okay? Often they're called zones. As a good example, when you start hearing like, I don't know if you guys experienced the Netflix outage that happened just recently. It happened because an availability zone inside of Amazon was going down. Okay, and so everything had to switch to a different availability zone. So zones are capable to have multiple different types of clusters within them, and that zone has different rule sets around the type of resilience that zone is going to have. Okay, what's called eventual consistency, right? If I have, if I'm Rackspace, I've got 3 data centers across the globe, and I've got, across the United States, in the 3 different geological locations, such as the West, the Midwest, and the of course, East. And as I deal with this, I build availability zones that are available to that particular set. So now I up layer it, right, up one more layer, and I can manage that availability zone and those clusters in between the different conversations. And that's really where you start looking at what's happening here, right? If I'm a Amazon type scenario, and I have these multiple availability zones across the infrastructure, I can have a secondary storage which is outside of that cluster, right? Because it needs to hold things like ISOs, patch files, things that I need to give or provide to the zone or that cluster. Okay? So this is the simplest cloud reference model you can look at. You will find that this particular model exists in all the virtualization platforms, as well as it exists in all the Amazon platforms. So when you see that Microsoft commercial and she's going, oh man, I'm going to jump up to the cloud, right? No, there's more behind it than what she's actually doing, right? There was an availability zone that was selected. It went through a load balancer, right, to figure out where it actually should go. It hit through some firewalls for the security and safety, and then it found its appropriate cluster, and then it found its appropriate host, and it did its work. Right? That gives you an idea of the cloud reference model and architecture. Right? And so when you start looking at that reference architecture and that movement, you start understanding why cloud computing. Right? Because cloud computing itself deals more with the unicorn than it deals with reality, right? Because what we're trying to figure out is how do we deliver OpEx type solution, but still be in a CapEx type world, right? I was dealing with this with the one customer who, after she did the scans and talked with the right people, she found that her business units were sending $135,000 a quarter to Amazon, building up machines and shadow IT all day long, right? And of course, there's security concerns, there's governance concerns, and so forth. But this is a software company, so most of the business units inside of software companies are like little startups, right? Instagram or any of these guys, they want their stuff now. They want to do the things now. They've got the budget to do it now. Let me get it going. Right? And so the obvious effect that was also happening that you have to also realize is that internally, we're usually at the IT level, we got one budget as well. And that budget is supported by the amount of users and the business units that I provide access to on a consistent basis. And so if their money is going out that direction and it never has a chance to come back in, I've got problems. Next year's budget is going to give problems. Having the ability to give the right conversations to the business units is going to have problems. And so we saw this piece, and so what we did is we decided to build a Amazon-like experience internally and apply the same operational controls, the same fiscal controls that are necessary in this environment. An example of this conversation is very easy. If I take a piece of hardware and let's say if I bought a server right now with 192 gigs of RAM and the right amount of processor cores, let's say that cost me $12,000. Okay, but with that particular server, I can actually do let's call it a 60-to-1 consolidation, right? Because I could actually put 60 virtual machines on that same piece of hardware. Well, what would I need to charge for the virtual machine to make that actual server, the cost of the server to go away, basically, right? Because it would be absorbed by people buying those particular machines on there, as any market would actually dictate. But if I did it to the point in which, of course, if I said I was going to do $6,000 per machine, right, per virtual machine that is, all of a sudden I have I can go past the cost of the actual server and actually deliver on the next host based on how many machines you've bought off the first host, right? Simple number conversation. Let's say I did 10-to-1. I did $5,000 per VM, right? I'd have $50,000 for that particular server in a consistent run rate. So when I needed to increase space or increase host, I simply took the money that I was already given for the $50,000 I'm charging already and just bought another host. Or bought new storage, or bought the existing thing. You have to have that fiscal economic structure in there, right? Because in a capacity-based situation, you could be coming in with an unused scenario, right? This is your static data center. When we first started talking about virtualization, we talked about it from the server consolidation aspect, and it was great, right? We'd come in and be like, man, this year, 5%, it was too much for everybody. They were like, you know what, I'm tired of my servers running at 5%. You consolidate those guys together for me. And we said, that's great. This created a great scenario because honestly, we were in the point where we were taking every server and splitting out all the server functions on different server sets and building out these huge data centers. Right? And when you look at it from a time and reality perspective, we are, if you look at it from just virtualization, this is the conversation you get into when you start looking at power plants back in the 1820s. Right? Thomas Edison, when he built the power plants across the United States, it was very key because previous to that point, a business to survive as a business had to build their own power plant. They had to have their own power inside, or they weren't going to do business. Same thing that we've been dealing with today. We've been building data centers inside so that we can do business. But there's one key thing wrong with that is how big you get inside that data center internally decreases your chance for recovery. Right? Because if the building goes down, I've got to have a second geographical location. Well, that's great, but if I keep building the amount of data inside of that one single location, the amount of pipe that's going to be necessary to get to that other failure location is going to grow as well. In which then, unfortunately, you get into the grandfather rotation conversation. How fast can I get data from point A to point B, and then how long is my recovery time period? Right? Excuse me. So internally, building your virtualization environment consistently, you'd run into your own problems. That's why putting it out to PG&E as an example, or doling out your electricity to a facility automatically sounded better, and that's why we all started moving that direction, right? Because there is that risk of unused and overcapacity or over-provisioning and underutilizing that environment, right? But when you pay by use instead of provisioning for peak, right, you have a reverse thing that could happen, right? You have a time-sensitive data center scenario, in which is absolutely imperative. We had a customer, as an example, I know dollars on the cents sounds kind of small sometimes, but we had a customer that they had a data center that was in San Jose, and the power and energy rate for San Jose is X. Okay, and let's just say that the power and energy rate in Arizona was cheaper than the annual budget that would be in San Jose. And so most of the developers that were coming to this environment were actually destined from India and Pakistan and a couple other different locations. So if you think from an actual physical sense, they were all still coming in through the same pipe. Whether they stopped in California or whether they stopped in Arizona really didn't make much of a difference to them, but it made $1 million difference worth of difference between that and the company. Because at that perspective, it was easier to use VMware's DPM capabilities to power down servers and power them up inside of Arizona based against the peak time of Saturdays and Sundays, because unfortunately in those countries they work every single day of the week versus we get Monday through Friday, right, most of the time. Now of course we don't have it better than France, so don't think twice about it. They rioted when they were going to 30+ hours a week. It's like, wow, that's great. So it's important when you're starting to think about how I transform OpEx into CapEx. How do I look at the thing that virtualization gave me, which was 24 hours of compute and understanding, real time, right? There is a situation where you can actually gain white space inside of most virtualization environments. And what I mean by white space specifically is that if I virtualize my DHCP server and if I virtualize my DNS server, you know how often those things are used, right? Maybe when a person comes on the network, right? Very low power, very low communication, right? But sitting in my virtualization environment, fully articulated inside there, has everything it needs, but will not register more than a blip on my CPU inside of my virtualization environment. So that means I can add more to the environment. I can add more machines in that environment during that level of real time. But if I'm not careful, right, if I did not look at what happens on the 31st of the month, right, and where everybody gets paid and all of a sudden accounting goes out of the white, and I'm at the red line on the CPU, when that DHCP server just wants to get that little tiny bump that it just normally has, it's not going to be able to do it. And so unfortunately, if you don't have the right capacity at that perspective, you could have lost revenue, right? Or depending on what the actual function is doing, you could have lost users, right? If it's a DHCP server and they didn't get an IP address because you had overcapacity in your virtualization environment, right? What's happening? And that's the risk and the reward of virtualization and cloud computing. It is the understanding of the right balance between what's my run rate, what's everybody doing on a consistent basis, and then can I build the capacity for it, or do I need to scale with the capacity? Right? Because, as you start looking, into the future, I see Gartner and I see all these different companies that have different predictions. And so, right here, right now, you're going to get my prediction. Okay? So, just to be clear, nobody's backing this except for the things that I've seen in the reality so far. So, traditionally, I'm seeing right now a large set of about 10% usage of external, right? People who are looking at the cloud. Now you may or may not, look at it from that perspective, but secondary data is out in the cloud in everybody's organization right now, right? If your organization, if any of your people in your organization know about Dropbox or know about ShareFile or know about any of those type of Cobalt backup cloud storage scenarios, your secondary data is out in the cloud, right? How you control it, how you look at it from that perspective, it is up to you. But primarily, most secondary data is going out to the cloud today. Okay, 90% of the time, everything's internal. I got all these, controls, SOX, compliance, everything that I need around it. All my controls are there. Okay, but over time, you're going to start looking at cloud bursting for short-term use of clouds, and understanding that there are times during, whether you're seasonal, as a great example, if any of you guys deal with taxes and constant conversation, this is your season, right? And your season's continuing to grow. One of our customers that we use today, they literally, all these tax offices, there's 77,000 of these particular desktops. They push them all out. We push the applications and virtual desktops to them. They work for the next 3 months. And April 15th, they start dropping off by the rate of 25% off of 77,000. And when they drop off, they take that thin client and they stick it in the closet. And when it starts up at the end of November and they want to start up again, they pull that thin client out of the closet, plug it up, and they start back over. And it's that burst and that conversation that we were able to talk to them about and convince them that was necessary. We have a lot of schools that use that type of technology to start bursting, to give them that level of compute that's necessary for that small bit of time. As I said, if you look at some of the prices, running it consistently out there doesn't necessarily make sense sometimes. But running it for the 3 hours that I'm running a class might make absolutely perfect sense. Right? So cloud bursting, you start seeing M&A, disaster recovery is another good conversation where, excuse me, disaster recovery, you know, you're currently pushing out that secondary data, right? You're starting to do backups out in the cloud. What's the difference between the backup that's out in the cloud and being able to find the compute necessary to run that same backup out there? Right? And that's where we start getting into when we start looking at disaster recovery, is that now, since I've got my backup out there, if you had a virtualization host that you could bring up and tie it back into my environment, all of a sudden disaster recovery is more of a reality in which I can actually have an RTO or an RPO that is actually obtainable. Right? And that's key, because previous to this point, you know, we could talk about, you know, Iron Mountain and taking backups and moving them out of here. That's great, right? But today, we actually have services that we can deal with that will take that 7-year retention time period without me buying, you know, gobs of storage in the environment, because they have ILMs. They bought those information lifecycle management devices, and they're charging me a premium, but it's over an OpEx of, you know, X amount of time period. So all of a sudden, now it's more economical to understand cloud bursting the way that it should be used. Mergers and acquisitions.
Got it.
So a good example of that is we have a customer that, you know, if you look at the SEC, they look at people who purchase other companies, how quickly they purchase them and integrate them into their environment is where they'll get, you know, kudos one way versus the other. We work with a lot of customers right now where they've bought another company, and what's necessary for us to do is we'll go over there. Before the SEC filing is completed, we'll go to the location, we'll virtualize their desktops and stuff that's in there. Now, we have saved the number of millions of dollars from intellectual property loss out of this world, right? Because when you buy a software company, you know, a couple of people know about it, a couple of things happen, some of them are disgruntled, some of them are like, you know what, I'm not going into that other one, I'm out of here. And they can do that because the other company hasn't finished the closing or finalized the piece. So there is points in time when data could be lost. So what we do is we come in from an escrow perspective, and we'll escrow the machines into a virtualized environment. The SEC filing will go through, and then we'll represent those particular virtual machines back to the company with the right applications from the purchased company. So M&A is a great scenario really to get into. Oh. Right? And then now, you know, as you start looking at this a little further out, you start looking at that 50-50, right? That ability for self-service, because self-service in itself is coming to the masses. Right, as we've seen, as soon as we can get, you know, my wife who's using, you know, 7 different clouds between Twitter, Facebook, and so forth, as the consumer is absorbing that and looking at that consumer lifestyle, they're coming into our offices and saying, you know what, I want the same thing. I want a virtual desktop. I don't want to use a desktop that I have to actually come up to, right? In a lot of situations, we're seeing that over 95% of us are going mobile. Right? When you start thinking about your traditional desktops the way that they are today, those are great, because normally I came in, I sat at a desk, and that was great. But a lot of these campuses are getting so big, right? You're wanting to move with your desktop and move to the next location or the next meeting. Now you're a mobile user and you didn't realize it, right? So we have to think about you from a mobile perspective. So you start getting into providing the self-service desktops and apps to the department admins so that they can start consuming those particular applications and delivering them from a cloud-based perspective versus figuring out how I'm going to run around to each desk and actually install an application. Okay? And then as we get further out, this is where we're actually looking at it from a 70% external and a 30% internal. Right? I'm going to hold all the golden eggs at my central facility, but I'm going to use the external cloud as much as I can possibly, because there are a lot of them, as you know, in any marketplace. The more providers you provide into a marketplace, the more it will drive the price of the product down very significantly. So as we are continuing to grow and these providers are continuing to get into the marketplace, you're starting to see a drop in the commodity of cloud resource, if you will. And that drop in commodity of cloud resource pushed out to 2015 should be substantial enough that we should be able to run full workloads out there and not think twice about it. All right, so you start really getting into how you're going to evolve with the cloud and how you're going to deliver services for that evolution. Okay. Now, as I said before, the first cloud model that you guys should really get into, or that you start looking at, is the infrastructure as a service model, right? Today's infrastructure usually has low utilization, right? Because it's so spread out across multiple things. When you look at a virtualization environment, your server and a virtualization host should be running at least 85 to 90% all the time, right? If it's not, what are we doing? Right, because of course we got that Moore's Law thing, and we've already surpassed it. Right, we're in this part where they're building more cores on top of it because there's just not enough to do. Right, I mean today we looked at large companies early on where they'd have 600-700 different servers, and a large company to me right now is 20 plus servers because of how well we're doing in density as far as virtualized environments. I was able to get 300 servers as an example on less than 21 servers easily, right? And these same infrastructure, but now it fits in a closet. And that's a big company. It's multi-thousands of people who are running in the environment, right? So our perspective is changing on how we utilize that level of hardware, how we utilize that tool. Today's infrastructure, you have little to no automation. In the infrastructure as a service, you should have a higher level of automation, right? You should have a provisioning scenario in which perhaps self-service, maybe not to the end user, but IT-based provision self-service may be the route you want to take, right? Or you may want to create a level of automation around the backup or the deployability, but that is part of your first step into the infrastructure as a service. Right, your lower server to IT staff ratio in an infrastructure as a service, it's higher server ratio, right? You have the ability to do something that most don't really realize when you deal with virtualization. And I'll give you an example of this. If you ever used a Citrix server, if you looked at Windows 2000 or 2008, there's a kernel space and there's a user space in the memory. And there's a finite limit that you can get to in the operating system as far as the memory that you use per person who's connecting and doing their thing, right? More than the memory that I can buy for that host, though, is gone, 192 gigs, 512 gigs, and so forth. So the host itself can do so much more. And that's when really virtualization starts really kicking in, because I can start slicing that guy into play. So that same server can now do more users and provide a better user experience because I've lowered the number of users per server, right? So the conflict is less, but I've increased the depth of the number of servers that I'm able to produce on that same piece of hardware, right? So it's an understanding of how do I create user perception, how do I maintain the right capabilities inside of the host environment at the same time, right? But it may be, hey, I got to build a higher server to staff ratio. So infrastructure today, static deployment for peak scale. That's the way we usually do it today, right? Your application vendors, right? They do not send you when they put that little minimum requirements list. Yeah, that's what it took to make sure it ran for sure. That's what the minimum requirements they sent you, right? Could it do it on less? Possibly. Isn't it, inside of virtualization, you get to have the ability to test that conversation, because I can give you 2 gigs of RAM, but if you don't use 2 gigs, then it doesn't make a difference to me. It goes back to my virtualization environment, right? But right now, I'm sticking to this peak of scale because that's what I've got to build towards. That's what I got to buy the physical environments for. As I move to that next one, I'm all dynamic. Doesn't necessarily make a difference. I'll give you what you asked for, and we'll see what you use. And that will make the major difference of consumption, right? This is all fully physical. In the infrastructure as a service, you have that physical virtual conversation. Having that conversation previous to this point, when I talk to database administrators and be like, hey, we're going to take your machine virtual, they'd be like, hold on. I don't necessarily want you to do that because I may lose something in the conversation. And of course, over time, we've explained to them, you don't lose anything. You continue to have the right capability. But there's often times when that database that they bought, is on SSD drives and so forth. But the web servers that are, housing or fronting that database, they can go virtual. Right? So you may have situations where you may make web servers that are virtual that are fronting a physical database as an example. Right, and last but not least, it's a difficult path to pass public cloud and so forth, staying in the infrastructure of today. It's hard to leverage any of those external resources. It's hard to leverage any of that capability externally out there. Whereas as an infrastructure as a service, mobility, virtualization gave the workloads mobility. And that was the key. That allows me to start moving it from here to a rack space. That allows me to move it from here to a Colorado facility that we're running within. Right? But in the end, it's all about efficiency. How efficient can I make it? Can I start small and scale? Right? Because that's what the word cloud, in my opinion, really means. It means being able to scale to the opportunity that exists in front of me. Right? I've got to be able to take advantage of what you're providing, but I've got to be able to get there as well. Right? An example of the private cloud, hybrid cloud scenario, your easy vCloud scenario with the right networking, the right clusters that are in play, the right storage, or you can flip over to an Amazon style cloud infrastructure. Right, where you have those availability zones, the object-based storage, which allows for it to extend across the environments, right? Or you can have right? There's nothing stopping you from creating your internal environment as an availability zone, right? And that's part of the management that you're providing. You have people who are in a dev ops scenario, and I want to produce that capability. Well, great, I use an external cloud for that, right? But I can also link it internally so that the front end perspective of it that the users come to will look like my cloud, right? And then I have the ability to start putting the right policies in place. I put in the right provisioning conversation, and I have the right application and template understanding to deliver on that cloud promise. Right? So the key features of a successful cloud, right? That multi-hypervisor support, you want to take advantage of all of them. I mean, if I were to say, I've gone into customers and I go, okay, so what do you want to do with virtualization? Well, I want to provision a virtual machine. I want to do a snapshot. I want to manage it. And we go through this whole list of things. And after we're done with this list, and I go, okay, do you want to pay for this list or do you want it for free? Right? Exactly, right? And then the smart guy goes, no, I want it for free. So you're telling me I already own this? Absolutely. There's ways that you can do it inside, as long as you're looking for those. All these, if you just follow the features that everybody is saying, right? There's nobody who's putting out a terabyte single VM today, right? I don't even know the need for a single terabyte VM. But all the hypervisors claim that they can do it. And that's great, but it doesn't make a difference to me, right? It's what I actually am going to use, and it's what I can actually do that makes the important piece of it. And that's, as I say, the value-driven cloud transformation that I'm really stressing here is that you want to take it from as much vision as possible. You want to look at your operations and figure out your operating model before you even try to look at the type of technology you want to implement, right? Availability zones. I kind of gave you that structure in that conversation. This is what everybody's talking about. This is what, you know, Netflix, Amazon, you know, all of them use these availability zones across the United States and across the global world to provide these particular spaces and so forth for us. And as you start getting into that nomenclature and you start understanding their hierarchies, it helps you build out what you actually want to gain from the cloud. But more importantly, it gives you the ability to audit your individual cloud providers, right? Because I'm not saying that there are cloud providers that are not necessarily, you know, it's ephemeral, right? You can't see it. It's a perishable item. No, you used, you know, 300, you know, kilowatts the other day. I saw it. I'm like, dude, let me see the report. Well, I'll give you a report. I mean, I got Photoshop. I got Adobe. I'll give you a report. Right? But did I really use it? That's the key question. And so there's pieces in which, now that you know the structure, you need to really look at how would I audit them if things needed to come into play. How do I make sure that if I'm using the right external provider, that he even owns his own building, right? And that was clear for us at one company that we were working with. They won this great financial deal, but unfortunately, they do a SaaS-based environment, but unfortunately, we have the U.S. Patriot Act. And so the company was from Canada, and that was wanting and said, hey, I don't want my data, my financial data, to be in the United States data center. You need to put it into a Canadian data center. And by the time we got hooked into the conversation, they'd already found this one provider that would do all that they wanted and everything of that nature. And I honestly, I was just asking to make sure out of my own checklist. I asked one thing. I said, do they own the building that they're working within? And the answer was no. And I'm going, okay, so literally you're going to put $1 billion database in a cloud provider, which you vetted the cloud provider. That's great. But if he defaults on his loan or his lease on his building for any chance or reason, you're out. That doesn't make good sense. And so understanding that value, understanding the vision that you need to put in there, that's key. Flexible network management, tenant isolation, those are very important, because this deals with your ownership conversation. Right? That's important, because your business units today, if they don't have a concept of ownership and their current concept of ownership is mine, right, there's a problem. And you have to be able to get past that barrier in your operating model and your people process first before that technology can actually take hold, right? Hardware-based licensing, there's a definitely conversation around that. So that actually is the end of my session. Let's see. I'm almost on time, right? I've actually written a couple of great articles out there. The Theory of Cloud Relativity is actually my article. You look it up, just type it in on Google, and you'll be able to find it. There's a lot of great conversations that go with understanding the relationship between the technology and then the relationship that's between the customer and your end user, right? If there are any questions, I'll be here all day. Definitely give me a call.
Thank you.